talk more on the phone. And I said, no. Hey, David.
Hey, something's going on here. Why can't I see? There we
Are
go.
you on a computer or on a phone?
I'm on my computer now.
If you look in the chat box, there's a link to the document that I'm trying to edit right now.
Okay.
There's too many sidebar discussions. I need somebody to pay my salary to do this.
So the sidebar discussions between you and other people, or between people, other parties?
There's some of that going on too, and part of that is we need to capture those. I mean, we need to set up special sessions, right? Because they're saying this is a really interesting topic, and I'm saying yes, it is. We need to make a special session out of it, but let's get through this stuff.
Right.
But then there's
like
people that are calling
basically.
me that say, they have a special topic they want to talk about, and so those turn into long conversations too. I mean, some of them that there are certain individuals who do not want to come on the calls, who would rather talk behind closed doors, like Rick Sutton, right?
Right.
Or I called Alan Lamb and talked to Alan, and he was very difficult to get a hold of. And then I reached out to Steve Maxwell and the guys at whatever they're called, Outer Line.
Oh, right.
So I'm going to talk to him probably Friday or something. But yeah, if you open that document, you can see where we're at. I mean, the problem is that the conversations meander, which is okay. I mean, we're capturing it all and we're transcribing it, but on the front end, it makes it kind of hard, especially, I think this is our most difficult piece. I think the performance
transition, you mean? What's the most difficult piece? The transition?
Just this, this group, this ADM level 3 group, which is middle school, high school, and basically everything that we have set up for them now is incorrect.
Right.
And so it's incorrect, but it's also the major group that we work with. And so there's just, a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. This is also this is what I call the low-hanging fruit. This is where people tend to do their work because it's easier sell for sponsors and supporters and stuff, because it's a little more tangible, because you see kids racing, you see them at these events and stuff like that. It's much more difficult to get people to say, look, can I have $5,000 so I can give a bunch of kids in this housing development a bike? It's almost like trying to prove a negative, right? The whole idea behind having a bike is that it sets you on a certain path in life. And you can't say that somebody succeeded with or without that bike, So
Right.
That's always the issue, is you're trying to prove a negative, essentially. You can't say to somebody, oh, well, if you don't give the kid a bike, he's not going to be his best self.
Drug addict.
Yeah. Drug dealer, drug addict, juvenile delinquent. And you can't say a bike kept him from doing that. It's only after the fact when the kid says, oh, it saved my life. You hear all these pro athletes talk about how cycling was huge for them.
And I think that's where Freddie wants to go, right? He was talking to me. It's one of those sidebar conversations. He's like, I really think this project would be really cool. I'm like, great, you do it.
Right, exactly.
I said, it sounds like it would be a great partnership between YCA and the Fast Freddy Foundation. You run it, and we'll help promote it, right?
Right. Well, like I said, through the foundation, I'm willing to do a lot of stuff, but we've got to fund it.
Yeah, I mean, some things like that podcast type idea of his, it's low hanging fruit. It doesn't really cost much. It costs him some time, to call up a pro and get him on the phone for an hour or whatever, and do it as a Zoom call, and I would say to do it asynchronously, not bring on other, do like our bike chat type thing where we have people coming on and talking, right? Just to do it, just one-on-one, and he can just lead them through questions, and then you just post it out and done.
Yeah.
But yeah, so do you have the document open?
I do.
Yeah,
Okay, so
there's somebody else in here too, but that's fine. I left it open especially for that.
it says 2 people. Anonymous Penguin and Sean Wilson,
Oh,
besides me.
yeah, and see, I see 2 people besides me.
So you see me and Anonymous Penguin.
Yeah, you're anonymous goose.
Is that what I am?
Yeah. But you can see where we're going. I mean, I try to highlight the things that we kind of need to talk about, and some of the big items that have still been left on the table. They're pretty far in. It's difficult to get into them. The first one is like, where are you running activities? And I couldn't nail people down. It's local, regional, national, or international, right? Those are your 4 choices,
Right.
from that global aspect. And everything that we've talked about so far, it's all local, local, local. Everything's local. And I'm trying to say, where do we, and so the question is, where do we start pushing that barrier? Where do we start traveling with kids to do other things? And maybe it's not just because you have to compete, but maybe you want to have them travel because it pushes their just boundaries, right? You're pushing their boundaries in other ways. You're forcing them outside their local environment, which stretches them as a person.
Yeah.
And they have to build new life skills in order to do that.
Yeah.
And I just don't know where that fits into this matrix. And it seems like in the middle school and high school, you have to do that. Just in terms of personal growth.
Yeah. And, but again, it's one of those things where it's a maturity level thing. Some kids in high school probably shouldn't be going on trips, regardless of where they are and why they're. I mean, because they're just knuckleheads. But it's one of those things where what's the big picture? Are you taking them to some place to race a bike? Or are you going to make them also do a little cultural investigation? Maybe go to a local museum or learn a little bit about local music or art or whatever it is. I mean, you kind of sort of have to figure what's your mission when you take a kid to race a bike somewhere, because generally speaking, when you go to play a sport, you don't only go to play the sport. Like, we go to a lot of soccer tournaments and basketball tournaments. We go, we play, and we leave.
Right.
And we don't really need to go to those tournaments because the teams we play are no better or no worse than the teams we could play locally. It's just nice to not play the same people all the time. But I think with bike racing, it's a little different. Oddly enough, you almost want to race against the same people all the time because those are the people who eventually you're going to be on the same team with as a pro if you stick with it, right? Like all these guys on EF, they all came up through the system together, and now after a couple of years of being in the World Tour, they all ended up on the same team. And that one kid was saying how great it is because he could step right into a real comfortable program because he knows everybody because they all grew up racing together.
Yeah, I mean, that goes into, we're going to deal a lot with that next week, right? When we talk about that high performance piece. But right now we're just talking about, your kids that come into the sport, they love the sport. You want them to be active for life, and that's the goal. That's it. And they could go into one of those 2 tracks. They could just go and be active for life, or they could go performance track. You don't know which direction they're going to go. That's we've come up with that's really the kids' decision on which direction they'll go.
Right.
And how far they go down that performance piece is really up to whatever the capacity of them and their perseverance.
Right.
And then, but at this stage, it's like, how many opportunities do we give them to build those life skills that are going to be important, independent of which track they go down?
We're independent of one thing that each track shares, though, is basically I don't know if it's not necessarily an ability, but it's the understanding that there's a lot, it's a big world. There's a lot to learn out there. And that's what the bike does, right? It opens up your world to you. Whether it's just riding for, like, say here, taking a trip over the bridge and riding in San Francisco or Marin County, or is it, traveling east into the foothills to do a race, I think the thing about a bike, everybody will tell you, and I think somebody mentioned it in that first conversation was a bike is freedom. And so it's really, it's a way of thinking about how you exist in the world and how you choose to live your life. Are you going to be open-minded and willing to explore and find yourself in situations where you're uncomfortable? Or are you going to just say, you know, I'm good. I like racing these office park crits. I know everybody have to go very far, right? And I think that's kind of what the whole, for us about the bike is, and even somebody said this, you know, our motto for the foundation is teaching life skills through cycling. It's really about understanding your potential as a human being. And some of that is putting yourself, is stretching your boundaries. It starts physically, and then it starts and then at the same time, I guess it's emotional and psychological, because it's scary for a kid to go discover their city on a bike. But knowing that they have the bike part down, because they feel safe on it, they can fix if they get a flat, they can fix it. They have a cell phone these days. They're not uncomfortable riding in the public. Then that part of it's taken care of, and then they can go broaden their horizons. And I think that's what the whole, and you carry, that's the thing, that's what you carry throughout your life, is the desire to explore, that sort of like childlike wonder of things around you, and always being curious, like what's around the next corner? Well, let's just ride around one more curve. Let's see what's a view. You know, we do that sometimes when we ride new roads. We're like, let's go a little farther just to see what's out there. You know, we have enough food, we have enough water. Let's just ride a little longer. And I think that's kind of the attitude that you're trying to instill in a kid with a bike, right? Because other sports don't do that, because they're played within a confined space, right? And even running. I mean, I was a marathon when I was a kid, and I'd go for, 30-mile runs, but that's on a bike, that's an hour and a half, right? On a running, that's friggin' all day, and you got to plan water and food and all this stuff. So that's what I mean. I think a bike is very unique in that way. And so we have to sort of figure that part of it out, I think.
That was good. Can I snip it out and actually post it?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, I knew Freddie had something like that too, talking about his own growing up. There's little vignettes that are tucked in these 15, 20 hours of material that I think we can pull out and start shoveling them out if we can get to it. But yeah, so I just
screw Freddie. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Exploration and adventure. I kind of put that under pushing boundaries, but it shows up elsewhere within this document.
Yeah.
But it comes back to, that, my central question is, with kids in this age group and exactly that, that you're pushing boundaries, and given the type of kid you're working with, maybe it's important to take them to Europe. Yeah. Right. And maybe you're taking them on a Marty Jamison tour instead of throwing them into Kermesse block.
Right.
And it gives them that cultural piece, because now all of a sudden they're in a country nobody speaks the language, and they're having to push the social cultural boundaries, as well as now they get to ride the bike and they understand the bike, and that's great, and they can see lots of stuff because it can travel really far every day.
Yeah.
But nobody they can't talk to anybody, right? And they have to figure that out.
Yeah, they learn how to eat through sign language, and then maybe you take them to the race to watch, or you let them ride the course before a race or after a race to see how hard it really is. Like the fun thing you could do with kids at that level is watch a race and time the laps, and then go out and let them ride it and say, okay, let's warm up, let's do a few laps, and then everybody do the hardest lap and see how fast we are compared to these guys. It's just fun, right? Because we do that all the time. We're like, man, do you realize how fast the pros go up a lot? Like for us, right? I live next to Mount Diablo, and you look at Strava KOMs on Mount Diablo, and the top 10 are all World Tour pros.
Right.
Right. And those guys are hauling ass. And the thing is, they do that after racing for 120 miles. So we always talk about that stuff. We're like, that is a level of fitness that is just, unattainable for us. It's amazing. We're amazed by it. and we don't try, and we appreciate it. That's the thing, is we're not trying to replicate it. We just enjoy our own pace up there, whatever little bit of suffering we're doing in our zone 4. But we can appreciate it because we're like, man, look at that. It's just, it's like what? Here's the thing. If I'm watching pro basketball, I'm never going to dunk a basketball, right? I'm not 7 feet tall. But if I'm 135 pounds, I might actually be able to ride as fast as a World Tour pro up a climb, right? I don't have to be on the World Tour to be as fast as a World Tour pro. That's the thing. You can compare yourself to those guys and actually do all the same rides. You can't do a 360 windmill dunk, or catch a diving touchdown in the corner of the end zone. You can pretend to do it, but unless you're in a pro, you're not going to do it. But you can go compete against the pros on a climb, right? You can go test yourself. So I think it's kind of fun that way. And if you're so inclined, do it. If not, you're like, I'm not going to kill myself to be that fit. So, So yeah, it's just hard to say. What honestly, because cycling is so broad, and it's not like most sports because there's this, like I was thinking about this. Baseball is baseball, basketball, football is football, but cycling is cyclocross, it's track, it's 3 kinds of mountain biking, it's road racing, it's time trials, right? I mean, it's probably
that's just the bike racing component. You're not even talking about bike packing, commuting.
Yep.
And all the other jazz.
Yeah. And bike packing could be sort of the whole touring on road or gravel. I mean, it's vast. It's way more vast than any other sport or hobby for that matter.
Yeah, that's part of it is that, in actually in my opening slides, depending on who comes on, I'll probably go through them again, but I talk about how we have all this diversity, and something that you always learn in academia is you have strength through diversity, right? And it's one of the strengths of our country even is that we have such a diverse landscape, but it's also a weakness because everybody, once you have all the diversity, you have people that want to embrace a certain piece of that diversity. And so that's causing all these silos.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you manage that? How do you manage the silos, especially when they refuse to talk to each other?
That's why I think part of our conversation from earlier was maybe we don't manage the silos. Maybe we manage the people who go into the silos so they have the strength to go in and out on their own.
Right. So that's almost that life skills part, is that we as coaches, we focus on building life skills, and it doesn't matter which silo they go into because they have the skills to bridge between the silos based on what they want to do.
Yes. Yep. And because you see that all the time in these pro mountain bikers, they all switch over to the road. All right. A lot of these guys didn't race any road until they were like, U23s. They're all mountain bikers. I mean, they train on the road, but most of them don't race on the road. Right. And so, I mean, look at Kate Courtney. I don't think she's ever raced on the road. Nope. Right.
Nope, not at all.
She could probably shred it on a shorter race, but she doesn't have the level of fitness to hang in a 100-mile road race or 80-mile road race.
And she may not have some of the critical skill set.
Right. But then you have guys like Peter Sagan and then what's his mug from Australia? The guy who won the tour. Spacing it. Cadel Evans. What's the other guy, the Dutch guy that was winning the tour, got kicked off? He was a mountain biker. So most of the, those guys cross over. And again, a lot of the mountain bike guys also do cyclocross. So.
Yeah. So another big thing that we didn't really get into, and this is why I called Rick, and I've called a couple other people that work in the event services industry, is, when we start talking about the events that the kids do, right now, we're really talking at that local, regional level,
right?
Is what does that look like? I mean, I have down here that we need high production value events, which are, basically like what NICA is doing, their high production value, which makes them, and we talked earlier today that they have to have a high fun factor, which, goes along with that production value. But what does that ecosystem look like? I mean, it's got to be a controlled ecosystem of some sort.
Yeah. You know, again, I think it's hard for the promoters though, because they need to make money. And a lot of those family friendly little segments of those events don't really make them any money. And so it's hard. And,
I mean,
you know, so crits have the same issue, right? I mean, it's really hard to have.
But you know, when you look at the Nike ecosystem, they have 1,000 kids.
Yeah, but
right?
they remember, and they
They're
split their events over 2 weekends. You know, and every kid pays the same. Like if you have a family event and you charge, you know, you and me $320 to do the fondo at Sea Otter, and we get beer and swag and everything, how much you can charge a kid to do a 1 mile cone course, right? But you've got to staff it. You've got to have insurance for it. Basically, it's got to be covered under there. You got to set it up. You got to have a space for it. You know, I mean, it's another segment. And again, it goes back to why all these guys do not have junior categories in all the local crits, because they're like, there's not enough kids to make it worth it. And it's time.
I mean, that's a chicken and an egg issue, right?
Yeah.
So Nike has done.
Oh yeah, totally.
They do purpose-built events with high production value. They don't do very many of them, and it draws in the entire community.
You know, they need to partner so that this is what we do in our, I'm in low-income housing. You know, I'm on the board of directors of a big low-income housing developer, and we partner with a lot of for-profit developers. And I was one who really promoted that. I was like, look, they're not the enemy. We actually we compete for a lot of locations with those guys, but a lot of times we end up partnering with them on a location. And it's the same thing. A lot of these promoters should partner with a nonprofit who's going to do the bike portion of it, like Bike East Bay. Like Bike East Bay does a lot of that stuff with Pedal Fest up here. Mm-hmm. They have that big cycling event in Jacqueline Square in Oakland, and Bike East Bay they're based there. Their office is right there in the middle of it all. So they do a portion of it. They do the bike rodeos, you know, and the changing of flat classes and all that kind of stuff. So there are partnerships possibilities.
I mean, I was thinking about that piece, you know, because, you know, with Nike, they own the ecosystem, right? So they hire the executive director for the region, and that's a paid staff position, right? So in this case, now we're talking about, you know, we just hire a subcontractor to put on the event, and we tell them it has to have these parameters.
Right. And we could run it through the foundation. Again, we have to have a budget for it, but we can run it through the Fast Freddy Foundation, because we partner with Bike East Bay all the time. So we have to pay them something as well, because they have all the staff and a lot, like they have the bike blenders and all the cones and all the chalk. And, you know, we do like helmet decorating stations. We do fun stuff at our events. So, you know, and then it turned into like the kids get to decorate their bikes, because here's the other thing we realized: all the bikes and helmets that we give these kids at these developments, at the low-income housing developments, all look the same, right?
So they have to personalize it.
Yeah. So we realized, oh wait, let's let the kids personalize it. So we have stickers and paints and all this fun stuff, and the kids totally personalize their bikes. That's one of the bigger highlights for them. You know, they name their bikes. A lot of these kids name their bikes, you know, because they built them. That's the other thing. Like, so we can do all those things. You know, we can do the events the bike building events that we do at the low-income housing developments. We could easily do outdoors. You know, I mean, we're not doing any of them now because we tend to do them indoors. Mm-hmm. But if we had to, we could do them outside, spread everybody out, put a mask on everybody. I mean, it's totally doable. You know, because we also sometimes we'll do 40 bikes. We do them in waves by age. We do the young kids first, and then, you know, like say 8 bikes at a time, and we move through the age groups, and because we end up at 10, so the 10-year-olds are last, and a lot of times the 10-year-olds have siblings younger, so they help build the siblings' bikes, right? And the younger sibling goes off and goes to the bike rodeo, and then the older kid starts building their bike, but because they help their sibling build the bike, they're really fast, mm-hmm. You know, and the bikes come almost fully built, right, out of the boxes from Specialized. So
it's basically just putting on the front wheel and doing the brake.
Brakes, pedals, stem, adjusting the bars, stem, seat, stuff like that, putting reflectors on. Yeah. Yeah, well, a lot of times too, you have to put the disc brakes on, but like I said, there's an adult there to check torque on everything. So
Yeah, I mean, so that was the other real critical thing. The critical piece, I think, of this equation is what do those events look like, that really kind of help the kids
yeah,
fully engage.
yeah,
And then you have to make it seems like it has to be appropriate based on whatever their development is, what life skill they need next, right? Because that's what
right.
you want to push them to, that whatever's next. And so you need a variety of different options to do, ranging from hyper local type things at your school and doing, micro things at school or playground based or in the town. And then you have things that are more regionally based that are maybe a little bucket list. And then you have bigger things that may be going on a tour, right? Or going to a national championship. I don't know if at this age, do you take them to a competitive thing at that level? Or would you say you're better off with a non-competitive thing? And then you say, okay, maybe we want to stretch you and send you on a European trip of some sort.
Right. That's what, again, if a kid is at that level, you can more than likely, we're going to be looking at their power and their heart rates and all this different stuff, right? Because they'll, at that level, they're training and they've probably got a coach and they've probably got a lot of data. So you could tell them just on their engine alone, would they even be able to hang? Would they be able to sit in? Like, just go be pack fodder. Don't try to win this race. Just go sit in and feel the speed of a European peloton at your age group, right? So that's,
I mean, part of that is, it's like at this level, we're still not quite in the performance track.
right.
So it's like, okay, but like what kind of experience do we give a kid in this level to have them see that this is something that they might want to do, right? So you're giving them an opportunity to see what it is, give a taste of it, put their toe in the water without having to go full in, right? And then
You could do simulated stuff. If you ask a kid, hey, do you want to race? Are you interested? Take them to a local crit, and the speed may be really exhilarating. And then you just run, but again, you don't put them in a race situation. You take them, it's almost like the early birds. You just take them through the same course, but you just mentor them and you just chat with them, and you could easily have a radio, and the mentor is wearing a radio and the kid's got the earpiece in, and you're just riding with them, and you can ride behind him, you can ride in front of him, depending on if you want to teach him what line to take through a turn, and then you can ride behind him and talk him through it. You could just let him do it, and you could just talk to him while he's riding his bike. I mean, technology's there, it's all there. So I mean, you could even use a phone. You could call the kid and have them have an earbud in. You could be talking to him.
Yeah, I was thinking about that one.
It's all there. I mean, technology's there to, to sort of move the needle. You could do. I mean, again, if you've got 4 kids, you just do a conference call, right? Put the phone in the kid's back pocket, and every kid has an earbud. Big deal. So it's all, like I said, I don't think that the thing is, I think that we need a really broad framework, and like almost, and same thing like with the coaching principles and everything else. It's all on paper, but everybody locally has to sort of take what works for them. And as they move up, though, it gets narrower and narrower, and there's less option because you're moving towards a selection criteria for USA Cycling. So at some point, you got to kind of play within the rules of the game, right? With respect to races you go to, showing your numbers, like all these guys, right? For like section, they say, show us your numbers. So at some point, you'll get there at some point. But some kids might not race juniors. They might not race till U23. Or like I said, they might be a world-class runner and get an injury and then be Michael Woods, right?
Right.
You just don't know.
I'm going to start bringing people in.
Okay.
Let's see. Disable the waiting room. Now my phone's telling me to be here. Well, good evening, everybody. We'll give people another minute or so to come in. Glad you could make it, Tana. Oh, she lost her audio. I think there's almost 20 people that registered. So we'll
great.
give people a minute.
Did Freddie register?
He did.
Okay.
He registered like right after you did.
Oh, okay. Because I texted him and said, hey, you should get on the call.
Yeah, he was on for the full 3 hours on Sunday. So.
Oh, he was. Okay.
Yeah.
I might hang up and go move into my office. So I'm going to hang up and go get back on in my office.
Okay.
Actually, I guess I could take my laptop in there. I was going to get on my desktop, but I'll just take this one.
So we'll go ahead and start with check-ins really quick. And so the check-in really just gives us a way for us to go into the recording, and it'll automatically transcribe who you are based on your name, which is pretty cool. So associated with that, if there's something that you don't want recorded, I recommend not saying it. And then, if we need to do a sidebar conversation or something for off camera, basically, or off recording, we can do that too. So for the check-in, we'll ask a question. So this morning I asked a question, and I'll ask something a little bit different, but we want to kind of get people in a framework of thinking like a teenager. I'm Sean Wilson, and the question for tonight is, what was your favorite TV show when you were a teenager? And for me, it's always been Star Trek. So that's pretty easy. So Daniel, you want to go?
Yeah, I lived in Wiesbaden, Germany when I was a teenager, and I didn't have access to television.
I'm sorry, you missed out on a huge part of life. Tana?
I'm with you, Sean. Star Trek.
Lynn?
It's a Star Trek kind of thing. That's why we all kept going to school. We kept hoping we'd invent some of that stuff.
Katie?
I'm going to have to say Saved by the Bell.
And Kristen? You're on mute.
I haven't got the slightest idea what the question is.
Oh, the question is, what's your favorite TV show when you were a teenager?
Oh, I was a science geek, and there was a PBS show called Zoom.
David?
Had to be a $6 million man.
$6 million man. Great. Okay. So most of you have been through these sessions. There's a couple of you who haven't been. I will try to do as quick a summary as I can to get everybody up onto the same page. And so here's kind of the slide deck. Kristen took us through the long-term athlete development models, and we're using that as our basis for what we're trying to do moving forward. And really, our goal, and I assume everybody can kind of see my slides. There might be some things covering it up. Yes, no, maybe?
I can see it.
Okay, great. So the major goal is to equate the bike with fun. And I think a big part of what we're going to have to do moving forward is demonstrate to basically our society that cycling is indeed an organized sport that can run alongside everybody else. And then interleave with that, it's, what are we trying to do within these different age groups? So we delineated that, we have these young age groups where we're looking at safe and fun. And then we have these 7 to 12-year-olds that are kind of an exploratory or adventure kind of realm. And there's now family orientation for a lot of things that are done. And then the kids that are moving forward, we really want to have desire with them. And we've talked a lot about exploration and adventure and building life skills through cycling is a big component of really what we're looking for, because the goal here is to have, athletes for life, is really the goal. One of the big things that we have in our sport that most sports don't have is a lot of diversity. So we can actually cross a lot of different boundaries in terms of the types of disciplines you can do with the bike. And that can be both competitive, and then you have a lot of non-competitive things that you can do on the bike, which is very different than most other sports. So it's very unique, and it gives us a lot of opportunities to do a lot of different things. But along with the strength in our diversity, we also have a major weakness in that most of these groups tend to silo themselves off, and they don't necessarily play well with others. And so it's causing, myopia, and then the athletes that are going down a specific silo may not ever cross over into a different silo. So as coaches, we're now thinking of this as an athlete-centered world. So we want to help athletes navigate those different silos and get them oriented in a way where they understand that they can cross those different boundaries, and start thinking in a multilateral way or multidisciplinary way about our sport. When we think about this from a global perspective, what we're trying to do is bring our passion and knowledge that we bring as coaches, along with development of processes, which is kind of what we're doing now. We're trying to develop some of these processes and do it in a sustainable way so that our sport can really move forward in a cohesive way. All right, so let me stop sharing, and let me make sure that we're going to bring up the Google document, and the Google document contains basically everything that the working group has been driving towards. And we've had a couple different sessions already. And what we're trying to do now is kind of refine what we're doing so we can put together basically a summary statement for what we've been working on within this group, which is, kind of level 3 ADM. And we think of it as middle school and high school athletics. So does everybody have the Google Doc? I got to get to my own here. So if at all possible, we want to try to not go down too many rabbit holes with our conversation. We want to try to keep it a little bit focused. And you can edit these things after the fact too. And what I'll probably be doing is tomorrow, I'll build out the slide deck like tomorrow evening. And so you have basically until then. And then even when I present the slide deck on Thursday, the slide deck itself will be open. It's done in the Google Slides, so everybody can edit it. So the first question is, what is our target audience? And, as I said, it really, in these age groups, we're looking at middle school and high school athletes, but it's really come out through a variety of different conversations that we're looking really at two different types of groups. We have those that have been actually tracking through those earlier age groups and are kind of coming in, and they actually understand our sport and are really moving forward. And then we have those that are just entering. They're probably coming from other sports. Maybe they've been disenfranchised, or maybe they found us through their friends or whatever, but they're entering at the middle school level. And so groups like NICA have really taken advantage of that to be able to capture those new athletes and be able to help them move forward. But they don't have quite as much time in our sport or as much background, right? So there's a lot of opportunities. And Kristen brought up earlier today that because our sport is so diverse and because we have so much going for us, is that we can actually be part of a sport sampling centerpiece, and we can actually be sport agnostic. So we can work with a variety of other sports in very interesting ways to be able to capture athletes and train them within our sport, and then hand them back over to their target sport so they can actually perform in those other sports. Is there anything else to add to that?
Well, Sean, just oddly enough, I think maybe we can even promote it as something very useful, so cross-pollination of sports, right? Use it as base training, endurance training for a lot of, sort of anaerobic sports.
Exactly. I think that's what you were getting at, correct, Kristen?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was getting at, that we've got such an incredible platform of off-season training. When the kids need a break from something else, when they're coming back from an injury, there's just so much potential for cycling as a complementary sport for so many. And what I really love about that model is that we know that most kids will stop playing some sort of organized sport, either in high school is a huge drop off or in college. And if this becomes, it's a great backup or a great secondary pickup when they can no longer play organized youth baseball and they become part of our family of a type of sport that someone can participate in as an adult, that they can do as a senior, they can do in so many different ways that starts driving up the interest and the impact in our sport. Sorry, he thinks he belongs in every conversation. But yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at. There's such a great crossover, and hopefully get those kids over into our sport as lifelong participants.
Great. Anything else to add to that? I mean, that covers a lot of ground, and that was a piece that we didn't have before. So thanks, Kristen, for that. I mean, you can always just type things in there if you think of something later on too. That's not a problem. I mean, this is all working documents at this point. So the next piece here is, what are the primary outcomes or goals for these riders? I mean, I've already said, that, the real thing that we're looking for is to get these kids onto a track where they're going to be lifelong cyclists. And certainly, there's the other piece, which is, a certain percentage of these are going to move into that performance track, but clearly not everybody is going to want to do that, and that's totally fine as long as they keep riding a bike. But there were some other things that got brought up, in terms of this building life lessons through sport kind of component, which was discussed quite a bit. There's interweaved with that is having socialization, creating a sense of belonging or a sport identity. So it seems like that's an important component of this. And then you also have community engagement pieces. So you want to get them to have a sense of community. And then you're trying to build in cooperation or the sense of team, and collaborative types of things, and then building out leadership skills. And then there was a couple of other things that have come out, in terms of building skill and mastery. And we haven't really even touched on building the engine, but that's always kind of a trajectory, right? If you're trying to build their capacity to do work and do longer rides or doing more things, you'd want to have some sort of training that's going to push them in the physicality as well as in these other things. Is there any other comments regarding these primary goals, outcomes?
Sorry, I missed all the other previous ones, but I was just sort of doing my homework on them, Sean. And when I was reading through the document, the one thing I noticed, I wrote some notes, was we had recruitment down. And I don't know if it's a personal thing, but I'm not sure if that's the way we should be thinking about it. Because you're not really recruiting people into the sport of cycling. I mean, we're also talking about cycling as a sport, but it's really, what we're really talking about is a lifestyle. And so we're trying to get it into these kids' DNA early. So they sort of, take it on their own, whether they want to be Olympic cyclists or, lifelong, just touring people or whatever it may be. And so that just hit me when I was reading the stuff. Before we go out too far, that's why I wanted to put it out there, was like, I just thought recruitment might not be the way to think about it. It just sort of puts you in a certain mindset before you even start going down a certain road.
So maybe people have talked about introducing people to our sport.
Right. It's introduction. And we have to even think about it. I mean, when you're saying it's a sport, it's like golf's a hobby and cycling's a sport or something, whatever the joke is. We sort of have to think about that. When you're introducing somebody to a sport, you're kind of saying, sports have rules and regulations, and there's a certain way they're done, and all these things about a sport. So again, this is stuff that it's just sort of, brain dump on you as we talk. So it's just something to think about, whether we call it sport or we call it a an endeavor, whatever it may be, you know.
Well, David, I think you bring up a really, really important point in that we're talking about engagement here, right? How do we engage people with cycling and understanding that it is way more complex? And this is the problem that we run into a lot of times when development models are put forth. It's actually something we're talking about at a couple different levels right now in different groups I work with, because a lot of people have taken the development model, which is really supposed to be a holistic, lifetime physical engagement model. They don't like it when we say it this way, but cradle to grave, right? Physical literacy, getting people to engage with their bodies as physical beings because of all the powerful physical and cognitive benefits of it, and social and everything else. If life, interest, opportunity, everything else takes them up a high performance pathway, brilliant. But at the same token, everybody's going to come off that high performance pathway at some point.
Right.
And it becomes a lifelong endeavor. So this is about engage. We have a really unique platform to engage people in something that little kids love to do and can do on a balance bike, all the way up through seniors can do.
Right.
And if we're not careful, you're absolutely right. The language that we use can turn people off because they'll feel like it's not for them. And a lot of people will get stuck in this model because they follow only the high performance pathway and only see that as the, oh, I got a bunch of kids who are interested, I'm going to put together a national team. And what we're seeing is in the models is that if we can get more people engaged, yeah, you'll get a deeper pipeline and a better pipeline. I've long said, and I've tried to put this to USA Cycling a couple of times, we need a bigger fan base. We need a bigger population of people that understand when someone's on the road, how fast we go, how much space we really need. And that'll be the benefit to me, that if we can get more people to value it, understand it, do it for fun, not see it as a threat to cars. Drives me insane. But yeah, so I think you're spot on with our language has to be really, really careful out here.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is jumping forward. So go ahead. But Sean, when I coached, I coach AU basketball and actually, Chris and I used to coach ice hockey at a high level as well. Is I never talk about work. You can't tell kids about work. Like I was talking to Freddie about this. It's work is the equal side of time plus effort equals work. So you don't have to talk about work, because if you're focusing on effort and putting the time in, the work gets done. But you never talk about it, because it just means it's just an amorphous word to a kid. But you hear all these coaches, guys in my own program, they all yell at these kids, you got to work harder. I'm like, what does that mean? Right? It means nothing. It means nothing to an adult. And so that's sort of, again, as that's part of the language of the whole thing we're talking about is sport. We have to be careful about that because it turns kids off. Yeah.
Plus, I think there needs to be a foundation of the sport being developed with using the same language that be introduced to all children. That's the one advantage to education, being where a child learns a sport for the first time, because the PE teachers use a commonality of language. And I'm amazed right now during this time period with the COVID, how many schools are starting to turn to having the kids ride to school, what little school they're getting, or get on a bike so that they learn transportation. The schools are really starting to embrace it more than ever. But we need to, with the sport, have a better foundation that everything can be built on it.
Yeah.
And Sean knows my background, so he can add whatever he wants.
Safe routes to school going in there.
Right.
Yeah, and so I don't really have anything else to add. I mean, I was looking for you guys to, see if there was anything else that's missing. I've already gotten my 2 cents into this as best I can. Is there anything else that needs to go into this piece? I mean, so some of it actually, I think, actually goes back to the previous piece, right? What David was getting at, in terms of, changing the framework, right? I mean, that's really what we're after. We're trying to change the narrative about our sport. And it's going to start at that most foundational level, that we change the vernacular of what we're using, and looking at what the ultimate goal is, which is to have lifetime cyclists in whatever they want to do. They can pick their own silo, say, but by changing the language, we can help that narrative.
Sean, I think your folks here just brought up a really great point for that primary goal area. Is this is part of this ongoing conversation that's happening, but cycling's got a really unique role in the connection of physical education, physical activity, and sport. They are three distinct concepts. We are one of the very few areas or very few sports that can truly, I think, go across all of them. Swimming's another one that perhaps has got some of that utility to it, and maybe the race walkers. But I'm kind of kidding about the alcohol though. But we have a really interesting opportunity and to bring together the people in those different spaces of the PE teachers, the folks that are just talking about physical engagement all the way up through.
Yeah. Well, hey, Kristen, so what we do with the Fast Freddy Foundation, we actually we work specialized and Bike East Bay, and we go to low-income housing developments, and we have the kids every kid who's under 10 years old gets a bike, but they have to build it themselves. And so our biggest thing is to create success through life. You have to create independence and a sense of not necessarily self-worth. That's kind of I don't know about that term, but really the sense of confidence that they can take these bikes and go anywhere with them, because a lot of these kids live in a bike desert. They live in a food desert, but they also live in a bike desert. There's no bike shops around, and they can't afford to go to a bike shop anyway. So we teach them to build their own bikes, and they're confident that they can take it anywhere and fix a flat tire. And so that's part of it. I think we're just trying to build a bigger pool, right? So our program is the week before, the parents and the kids have to take a mandatory class first on safety given by Bike East Bay. And then we do the bike build event. And then after the kids build their bikes, they go out and they do a bike rodeo. They have fun. There's games and stuff, and there's prizes. They decorate their own bikes because the bikes come from Specialized, so they all look the same, and so do the helmets. So the kids decorate the bikes and their helmets, and most every kid names their bike. And right, because it's a way to personalize everything.
Love that.
And it's really kind of sneaking in some STEM in there, right? Because they're learning the physics of a bike and like how to tighten a screw and things. And then we leave tools and extra tubes and things at the locations. And then we go back in a month later and we just make sure everything's okay. But that's really all we do. We had an intention originally to maybe do some bike trips later on as the kids get safer and a little bit older and the ability to ride farther distances, maybe do some road trips and stuff like that. We're in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, so we've got tons of great road riding for the kids, and even trails and things, dirt trails and paved trails. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to do stuff, which, like I was talking with Sean, to partner, our foundation can easily partner with a lot of these bike promoters, event promoters, and do the family portion of it. As long as it's funded, we have the wherewithal to pull it off because we do it fairly regularly. But the big thing is, like, all these bike promoters aren't going to do it because it's just a money pit for them. They're trying to make money.
I hate to cut you off, but we'll get to that. We'll get to the event promotions towards the end.
Okay.
Great stuff, though.
Yep. So, moving on to the next part of this, which is who runs the activities, and David just touched on part of it, and that goes into what we covered last week is kind of the age groups you're looking at, David, and maybe we need to get that piece into the puzzle. It really wasn't in there, about working with community groups like yours and foundations to introduce bicycles to young kids. But in this kind of space, we're looking at two basic entities. It seems like we have school-based programs like what Tana's put together. You said youth educational sports programs, and then we have community-based programs, traditional bike clubs and things like that. And there's certainly strengths and weaknesses about that. And Lester brought up a lot of good points, kind of pushing more towards community-based programs because you get kids that are already interested in the programming, whereas they were doing the things that he was involved with was related to the Olympics in in Utah, and they were charged. His group was charged with taking the sports to schools to do just basically 1 day introductions, and he basically said that that was a failure because you don't really get good enough engagement. Whereas a program like Tana's, which is a multi-day, multi-week type thing, is you get really good engagement. So it seems like that is a great way to, you could introduce the programs to kids, but assuming that you had a kid that was already engaged from an earlier age group, you're now continuing that education process, which is something that we've talked about before being absolutely critical, is having continuity in the programming across the age groups. And then the other thing, related to high schoolers, we had a lot of discussion about lettering in school, and there being, a couple of components to it. One being, that social component of, looking good for your peers. But then there's another practical component in that you also get kudos when you go to college by lettering and having that on your transcripts. So it actually helps independent of the idea of, getting scholarships or whatever that is. And so, interfaced with that, schools are, you would argue are the best approach because you have access to 100% of the kids, whereas any community-based program, you're not going to have quite that level of engagement. And then, people also brought up that school-based programs tend to have two different structures. You can have an internal club, or it can be more external, and NICA kind of works in that framework, and I think that's where it came from. And then there was also a lot of discussion about the need for youth-specific clubs because our traditional cycling club model is really an all ages model, and there's been erosion of the mentorship components that were associated with that in the past, and things of that nature. So that's another critical piece. And the need, it shows the need for having youth-specific organizations. And then you have other opportunities related to community centers, YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs. And then there was some discussion about scouting troops, and somebody even talked about specifically about having cycling merit badges for different competencies. That's an interesting model and something that we've been playing within our own group. And the kids, I think the kids will that'll really resonate with the kids, getting stickers and things like that. And then it also came out this afternoon that as the kids become older, we were talking about specifically what does the coach need to be in order to work with the kids. And it seems like as the kids become older, you need to have some sort of specialization in the coach that's more dependent on what they are doing. So kind of more into which silo they're going to go into. You need a little bit of that. But the coaches, above all else, they have to be relevant for the athlete. So, in the younger age groups, it seemed like you almost wanted a peer role model type thing. The very little kids, it's better if you have like a teenager or like a college age student. But with these age groups, it really didn't seem to matter so much. Kristen, do you have anything else to add to that? I mean, it was, this was anecdotal based on our own experiences.
Yeah, no, and I think that there's some really great stuff in there that when you're looking at the high schooler kids, there is a lot to be said for they still do care about the people who are not quite parents, but it's less important that it's like they're not going to look at a college student necessarily so much differently than a middle schooler is really looking at the high schoolers, and the elementary schools are really looking at the high schoolers. For the high schoolers, it's really just more important that it's somebody outside their own family, that it's another adult that's sort of giving them some attention, that's valuing their opinion as a, growing peer kind of an idea that they tend to resonate with the most. And I think for a lot of the kids, finding an opportunity where they can start to, because at that age group, they're really starting to play with their identity. They're expanding it out. They're starting to experiment a little bit with who they are and who they want to be, putting on different skins and all the ways that they like to change their dress and change some of those things. So giving them opportunities to explore. And even the idea, I love the piece you're talking about. I know we were going a slightly different direction then, but decorating bikes and naming bikes and doing all that is still a way to start to show their own identities. And so anything in this space that you can give them an opportunity to do that is huge. And another piece that we look at sort of that sense of competence, this is a great age to turn around and have them do some leadership with the younger kids. That while they're not necessarily looking for that from above, they're looking for that recognition of their competence. We're doing this right now with a whole bunch of kids on ice, pulling in some of our less engaged high schoolers into coaching with the littlest kids. And it's really reinvigorating, re-engaging their connection. And so there's some great opportunities there too, I think.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things too. They always say the best way to learn something is to teach it. But you know, the difference too for a lot of these, because again, I've coached multiple sports, and cycling is the one sport where a lot of times the kids are faster than the coach, right? So it's actually kind of hard to coach a kid when they can drop you on a climb or just rail a downhill. And you're sort of like, they're fearless, right? Because when I was coaching the open composite team, these kids were fearless. And as an adult, you're kind of like, well, I got to go to work tomorrow, you know? And so it's a different dynamic as well. And versus coaching in like basketball, where you're in a gym and everybody's sitting around and you're talking and they're running up and down the court. But as a coach, you're not running much. You might be able to still shoot with them, but you're not running up and down the court with them. So it's a little different dynamic. I think people who work with kids on bikes, they're a different breed. They really are. I mean, as somebody who's coached multiple sports, it's a different kind of coaching. It's hard to coach when you're out of breath, right? I mean, really, these kids are fast when they get to high school. But so it's different, I think. I think we.
Well, and that's where we. Yeah, I was gonna say, and that's where you differentiate a little bit between, you know, like a cross country coach or other people. Part of that is cultural, that you know, the need to be riding with them as opposed to supervising their riding, and part of that safety and all those types of things. But there are some really interesting applications of opportunities to bring in people of different abilities to assist.
Yeah.
And some of those can be your high schoolers and kids that maybe not want to race or maybe aren't interested in some of the other pathways, and to start to build a feeder system of engagement.
Well, that's why NICA has the middle school program.
Mm-hmm.
We started that actually at T-Mobile at the composite team. And I was telling Sean, the reason why we started that is because we had a bunch of high school kids who had younger siblings who were riding with us, and they were just as good. And so we talked about it, and that's when Austin was the ED, and he's a good friend of mine. And he asked me, should we let the middle school kids race? And I said, no, we shouldn't. They should support and kind of learn how the system works, basically. And that's what they do now. They go to races, they support, you know, they do the feed zones, they do the tents, all the stuff. So they're in the system for 2 years before they ever actually start racing. And this is what Sean's talking about. It's that transition, you know, and some of these kids they support, but they end up not even racing in high school, but they do the middle school section of it because their older sibling is on the team, and they love it. They love being part of the group, but when they get to that level, they don't want to race. They just want to ride. And so that's good as well. So I think that's where we'll sort of focus on is how do you keep these kids engaged? What makes it fun for them? You know, like Sean and I were talking about, some of these kids, they're so good at the high school level. They basically use NICA as training, you know, their focus is way beyond NICA already.
Well, I think, Sean, what you're getting at is really looking for multiple ways to provide opportunities for affiliation, because that is the one thing that teens are really looking for. Is they want a peer group, they want to fit in, they want to have community, and particularly because our sports system does not allow for differentiation from sort of that all-American football player kind of an idea. I mean, our soccer programs, our lacrosse, all of those have sort of followed that same model. Mm-hmm. The only sport that sort of deviates is your cross-country running can sometimes get your eclectic kids. Cycling has a real opportunity because of the fact that you can race, you can ride, you can support, you know, there's so many different ways you can engage. We have a real opportunity to provide affiliation for teens in multiple avenues.
Right. I mean, so the question becomes, how do we harness that? I mean, very often you hear that, that the high school cyclist athlete is, kind of bottom rung. I mean, I've got stories of Brandon McNulty coming back from the peace race and going to high school right after he won, and they're basically asking, where have you been for the last week, Brandon? And by the way,
Well,
we just won our football players got fourth place in the division, right? Which is like almost meaningless compared to what he did.
well, that's a cultural question, though. That's a cultural awareness of, and you're going to have that problem with any of the sport that's not in the NFHS system. That's not a mainstream sport. Your skiers, everybody, and you're also starting to highlight any activity that a kid's going to do that's not that's part of their school system. And so that's a bigger question. How do we infiltrate into the school system and get them to value it? But within the kids themselves, the community, how do you, and I think NICA started to do this, right? They've got their adventure program. They've got their grit program. They've got some of those others. How do you start to build ways for kids to engage so that in this community, they're getting recognition? They may not get it in high school. That's a whole, Friday Night Lights sociocultural thing that's going on that'll be slow to change. But if giving them a safe place to do this, so this is the call for clubs and programs that support kids, that do these things. It's finding ways to engage with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and all the other programs that offer kids an opportunity to engage and saying, hey, here's a curriculum for cycling, or here's the long-term development model for cycling that you can sort of be a part of this national conversation and this national recognition. It doesn't have to be racing. It can come in so many different ways. But I think, I mean, you can talk to anybody who's been involved with NICA. The fight to get into the scholastic system is intense.
Yeah, we had a long discussion about that earlier, and maybe this isn't the appropriate place, because we're trying to work at the 10,000 foot level. Maybe this is much more down at the 1,000 foot level, or even in the trenches. But now I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, let's take the NGB. Can the NGB be pushing on the on the National High School Federation for these things? And I called them, I talked with them, and they said that it had to be a ground up approach.
Well, and the reason is so just so everybody's clear, the National Federation of High Schools is the national organization that governs high school support. We're on since the early 2000s. But they don't have any oversight. So within each state, your state high school scholastic program, which governs middle school and high school support, that's a separate entity. It's not part of your education system. It's not part of the Board of Ed. They are a nonprofit that operates in the state, often with the support of the athletic directors, principals, and the Board of Education, but they're separate. And the only affiliation they have with the NFHS is that they follow the rule book for the sport, which may or may not be the same as the rule book for the sport as it applies to club sport, AAU, NGB sport. They can all be different, right? Soccer, there's like 5. And so NFHS does not dictate to the states what sports they do. That is done within the state system. And that's how lacrosse in some states is allowed and in some states not. Some states it's clubs, some it's varsity. Same with cross country skiing and with some of the other sports. And so I think you're right. Separating out the culture and the system in which this all works, and then thinking about the development model for kids. If we have a solid development model for kids, it actually becomes a selling point to go to those organizations and say, we have a whole system here we're trying to work with, and this is why we need to help high schools. Having this will help that conversation, but it's still a long conversation that'll be had.
Right. And when I called them, it was like, okay, I started unpacking, and it's like, okay, this takes us 10 years.
Yeah.
And it goes along with and it goes into that, the lettering and all that jazz, right? In high schools and stuff like that, right? It seems like all those things are kind of, they're interrelated things at that level. Because what it came out, it came out to earlier today is that, I can go to my local high school and put pressure on them as a parent or even now as a coach, and put pressure on them to, have our kids letter. But it seems like that's a very, it's going school by school and at that level is just not time efficient as a sport. And it's a very long, drawn out battle, right? And you could actually go backwards just depending on who's involved, right? They could just end up dropping the sport, after a year or two.
Well, the
Well, and
biggest
you're
question,
also-
does it add value? I mean, is it worth it?
Well, the bigger question is going to be the finances and the perceived injuries and all that kind of stuff. Right now, more and more states are moving towards pay to play. So at the high school level, they certainly have models to help kids who have lower funding, but they're moving to pay to play. Sports are getting cut. This is not a new trend. This is a slow 10-year trend. And getting something onto the books in a school, especially when we're seeing in a lot of places the numbers dwindling, can be really challenging. It's much easier to get it in as a club opportunity and allow some of those types of things. But I think that conversation is a whole separate, how do you provide people with resources to go in and make that argument state by state? But if we're really looking at the kids, it's how do we create a model that we can help coaches and parents understand, so that not every kid tries to get shoved into an adult racing model before they are competitive minded, before they're emotionally ready, before we figure out if that's even what they want to do. How do we make sure they get on a bike and they love being on a bike?
Right. And I think that'll come out in some of these next questions.
Yeah, I
And
do
so
too.
the last piece of this puzzle, just in this space of who's running the activities, it really came out that you need a set of coaching competencies that go along with the model itself, right? So, whatever curriculum we're designing for the kids to keep them on track, you need a coaching component, a competency that goes hand in hand with it.
Well, I think Tara's a teacher. I was guessing from her comments earlier, and that's the movement that we're working on right now. Is you can't talk about how to develop kids without then thinking about what's the knowledge and what are the skills that the teachers need for what we call right age, right stage teaching, or right age, right stage coaching.
Yeah, maybe Tana can speak to this a little bit, because she has a full model for elementary, middle, and high school, and how do we interface with her school-based programming? And she and I have had these discussions in years past, and bringing those kids off of the school ground and into what you might consider a traditional club system, and it's a very difficult piece to solve. And that's where, I just kind of said at the outstart, that we have these two tracks. We have a school track and we have a community track. And I don't know how the two things intertwine easily. And maybe they don't. We have a soccer in Redlands, they have relationships between them. They don't overlap, but the kids are the same groups of kids. And when the school goes live, the club system goes dark, and they just have this relationship that they've worked out over time. And there's friction, of course, but I don't know if we can have a system like that within our cycling model that works, that operates well.
It's time will tell, because a lot of the other sports have had a lot more time to get these things established. The first thing that needs to happen is a same vocabulary. So at least the teachers can talk with the parents, can talk with everybody on the same language. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we had a huge grant that we were just rolling out to train all the middle school teachers. That's 150 teachers in LA Unified, how to do a cycling program. And from that, it would trickle down automatically to the elementary school level. And then, waiting to see how this was going to develop into the high school. The main thing the school should only be concerned about is putting down a foundation that is common for a child that if you have we're back to the child identity and being able to have that positive identity with cycling. Let's say this child finds he can, ride well on the running track as a cyclist and train well, but then they move. Isn't that wonderful how in other sports, if they move to another school, it's the same language. And the teachers can talk to them. That immediately opens up the doors for them again. And it amazes me in that sense. Teachers are very intuitive, especially coaches, cycling. Those PE coaches that I've met that are also into cycling, they just take this and go in leaps and bounds. But it's once again building the vocabulary, building the same curriculum that is a foundation for all types of bicycling. And that's all that schools in the PE department should be focusing on. That's enough right there. Then from there, the PE teachers who are used to establishing the clubs and what have you outside, they'll just step up. And they will do that. And then from there, we need to have the feeder into the larger racing organizations with USA Cycling. So, and that, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at what Christian wrote here, and it's really, speaking to what you're saying also. So it seems like whatever curriculum. So I mean, we're and Christian's right. I'm a little bit ahead of myself, and sorry, I always do that. I always try to think a couple steps ahead, and feel free to shut me down at that point. But
Well,
in this case,
what Tana's really starting to talk about, which is so crucial, right, is that if we think about this model we're trying to develop, teachers are trained. Teachers have 4 years of training, and so certainly there are good teachers and bad teachers, just like in any profession. But even the average ones have got 4 years of training in which they develop the skills to think about the child first. What's the curriculum for the child? What's the development path? Which is why it's not a perfect system, because you can go from one state to another, and a fourth grader, the school they were at before might have had stuff switched here or there, but it's still relatively the same developmental pattern. We go into our cycling world or into any of our sports world, and the coaches don't have that. That's not necessarily something, but it's better than ad hoc, just everybody's playing by themselves. So can we create something that says when a child is, ideally they've been introduced to a balance bike by the time they're 18 months, and by the time they're 4, they're on a pedal bike, and by the time they're, I think that's so powerful.
And you mentioned it earlier. The one thing about it being introduced through education is every child is introduced. It isn't just the parent that signs up with a permission slip. Plus, that every child includes children with special needs. Okay? And that's the most amazing, wonderful part. And you'd be surprised how the PE teachers just love that as well, because their PE programs quite often are inclusive. And when it comes to bicycling, it separates them. And there's a way, we actually did this up in Glendale in one of the high schools up there, that we had a class, and we had to break it in two, because we had to start the special needs students with just how to, glide and learn balance, because they're not taught balance in PE. And the teachers were going, oh my God, we've missed that element. And so here was the school thoroughly embracing bicycling, because it actually caused an inclusive program, because the students got going. And now these students who probably never be able to drive a car, they're going to be able to ride a bike and get places and do things. So cycling is the most amazing sport. And I come out of, my grandparents were coaches in the Olympics in swimming and diving. Where did I go? I went to cycling, because to me, it embraced more people, embraced more levels. And that's the biggest selling item. You can go to the schools They can apply for the grant and the funding and the money to get it going. They want it. And Sean, feel free to, turn me off at any time, I'll
Yeah, I mean, we
just
can,
keep talking.
and we could probably move on now. I mean, and we definitely, I want to get you and Outright and a couple other programs together that work in this space so we can have that specific discussion about what that looks like and how we bring you guys to the forefront of a lot of these activities and, building out that, that common language, right? That then, maybe as we're building this out, maybe then we adopt that common language that's much more that speaks more to the child than what is our our current language that we use within the sport, and then we use that moving forward. I don't know what's
Yes,
what's
definitely, definitely. No, you're hitting it right on the nail. Absolutely.
And I work closely with Outright. I mean, they're funding me. I have a grant with them now, so
Oh, good.
yeah. So
You know John Cruzy, right?
no.
Okay, yeah. All right, never mind.
Yeah, so I'm working with Sky and Andy and Esther.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's move on to the next piece of this puzzle is where the activities are run. We've talked a lot about schools. It's much further down. I'm not sure even what page it's on. But everything that we've talked about is local, local, local. I mean, it's like, take them to the park, take them to go do things at school, do things on roadways, trail systems that are located right where the kids are, right? So you're basically bringing the activity to the kid. And in our sport now, as we know, especially if you're in the competition side of things, even if you're in NICA, you have to travel to do events. And so, once we move beyond, say, the training, and which is definitely local, where do we start taking them, and what does that event structure look like? And one of the things that really came out was you're trying to push boundaries, right? You're building life skills through the sport, and so because of that, I think of travel may be part of that equation, and you have both the ability to do competition-based programming and non-competition things. And there was a lot of discussion regarding exploration and adventure, doing weekend-based activities, things that are have a high social component to that, but they're also kind of pushing the boundaries for the kids, and they're special, right? These are special events, basically. And then the last one being kind of the virtual space, and we have that moving forward. But really, when we think about pushing those boundaries, especially if we're talking about traveling, when you're dealing with a kid that's just entering the sports, it's one thing when you have these performance kids and they're traveling everywhere. But within this space, what's an appropriate travel time or distance, and how many of them should be happening? NICA, I mean, they have roughly 5 events, and you can travel 3 to 5 hours to get to them one way. So what should it really look like?
Well, again, Sean, I get a little bit worried just from the perspective of making sure we're not conflating too much the systems and the structures and all that with what's most appropriate for the kids. And what's most appropriate for the kids should be driven by what evidence we do have. And so there are models out there where we can start to look at what are the recommendations for how much, like, for example, with Little League, there are recommendations for how much a child should hit based on what we know about the wear and tear on young joints and what they can handle. And those recommendations for what's age appropriate for the volume and the amount of time should be based on, where they are physiologically, where they are emotionally. And then from that, then we can be making recommendations for how to design a system, because we're going to have we're always going to have this problem. It's going to happen across the board. There's the current system that's happening, and then there's a system that would be ideal for the best development of the kids. And I think the best development for the kids model, where we started at the beginning of this, is what needs to be the foundation. And then you can figure out ways to evolve the current system into the ideal system. But my question would be, where are we getting that information? What's informing that conversation around, go back to that age-old conversation around gear ratios and
Yeah.
age and when's it appropriate.
Yeah.
And the same goes for the hours on the bike. And granted, there's always a range, but if we're looking at it from a developmental, so we've got to identify developmental age, how much training time, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just a little concerned that I don't want the market to drive the choices.
Right. And that's what I think has happened. Right. And that's why I really
Mhm.
wanted this piece in there is, when I look at, what we're doing with the kids is you go into cycling versus going into soccer right now, and immediately within cycling at any age, you're on a travel team, as
Mhm.
opposed to soccer, you're AYSO, you're local. And to me, that says right off the bat that, maybe we're off the mark. Right. And so then it's like, okay, if we're off the mark, what is the mark? I don't know what the mark is, and I don't really read too much into that space, so I don't know the real evidence behind what is an appropriate amount of travel. But then I think about it from a developmental standpoint. It's like, if our goal is to develop life skills and push boundaries, and travel should be part of that equation, because you want them to experience new things in their life, and it's whatever stage of development they're at. And that came out as part of the conversation earlier this afternoon, is that, it's really dependent on the kid. I mean, some kids are, they're ready to travel. I mean, so I would say like Katie's son, who flew out and by himself on a plane, he's 15, flew out by himself from the East Coast, flew to the West Coast. We had John Parrish pick him up at the airport, take him to the hotel. I wasn't even there yet. He got left there by
For
himself.
sure.
And, but he's developmentally okay for that. We had another kid in our group who was his same age, who, no, definitely not. I mean, he was barely competent to travel with us, even though, he was the same age, right? And but he was traveling with us, right? And he was always monitored. And it's
Well,
just a
that,
developmental thing, right?
but Sean, that goes back to the earlier point that I was making, that this is where it often gets, and I've had Jim Miller and I've gone round and round about this, many times over the years, is because that's the difference between an NGB doing it and this group doing it. The model has to be for the average kid, the kid coming in that's not on the competition train. And as soon as you start to go, yeah, but some kids are ready to race. Yeah, Finney was ready to go at the age of 17, right? That's an anomaly. There are always going to be the kids that are ready for the gifted program, and the one kid that's going to graduate high school and get a college degree by the time he's 12. But what we're trying to develop has to be for the average kid, knowing that the vast majority of our kids will not go on. It's just the average of numbers. They've run it in other sports. No one's run it in cycling because we don't have the volume. The majority of kids will not feel it. The majority of kids will not get a college scholarship. Sport. The feeder system goes to a fine point, right? So the model has to be at its base about the general, and then on which you can build the acceleration models and the kid who's truly ready, and the kid and take into account, which I argue a lot with people, just because the kid's physiologically ready doesn't mean that they're psychologically ready. But if you don't have that base, and so making sure we don't get caught up in all the exceptions of the kid who's, I've worked with Barney for years, and we never took a team to Bidabee that wasn't on that scale of any one of those kids could fly. That was one of the metrics by which I made recommendations to the national. Can this kid function as a mini adult, right? Now,
Right.
if they can't, I didn't recommend him to Barney, or he would have had my head. But that's the exception, right? That's the kid that's ready to go to college at 16 and emancipate. That's not the normal kid.
Right. And so that's exactly why I wanted to bring it out, is because, our sport is way shifted over, right, from that. And so, in all of our conversations, everything's been local. And so now I'm saying, at what point is it appropriate for us to start taking kids outside their comfortable local environment and putting them into other things? And, another example is, one thing parents do is they take their kids on vacation, right? It's pushing a boundary by doing that, right? You're taking them out of their home world and you're putting them in a unique environment where they have to do new things. And, independent
Why
of the
don't you
money.
make,
So now we're
right.
looking at it from that space. You take the kid and I don't know if it fits the bulk of the kids, but there's some percentage that fit into that scheme that they're going to do well by taking them out of their environment. It's going to help them grow by pushing their boundary a little bit.
And
There's just so many things that play into that.
Right. There is so many things that play into that. And if you look at most schools, when they deal with just their community, they don't deal beyond that because they realize that most of those kids can't go beyond their community. If it's going to the next middle school to do a basketball tournament, or the community comes to the high school and they watch the running track and field, it's in a community level. It stays in a community level until it becomes to a point that someone is exceptional at that community level. Then those are the ones that get moved to, Colorado Springs, Olympic Training Center. Then all of a sudden they get recommended over there. It would be the appropriate example of the higher level and where it can go. But it's the case that you have to have a way that a child knows where that boundary is, where they're safe. A lot of the schools I dealt with, they like the program that I give them because they do it on campus. They don't go off campus and ride. They do it on campus. In many cases, the liability aspect of the school doesn't want them to go off, even if they're riding on the sidewalk, if a teacher is taking them. But it, once again, that creates that community, and, to then take it to the next level of competition. That's what the school grounds are good for. You have a running track. You can do track. You can do, you have to work within that level for that child is comfortable. And a school is where they spend so much of their time. Let them get their comfortability there and then go to a similar situation of another school and compete there before we send them off, is my opinion anyway.
Okay. I mean, so again, at this level, we have kids that are fully engaged and they're somewhere in the middle school to, high school level. And,
Right.
But so the basic thing is that local community level is preferred for the bulk of activities. And then maybe there's some sort of realm for pushing boundaries, with some sort of travel, but it seems like it's a pretty minor component of the total.
Right.
It,
and, it is based, yeah, it's pretty minor. And it also depends on their community. Does their community have a velodrome? Does their community have mountains? It all depends what's there geographically as to what is pushing their boundaries in many ways.
So I'm reading Kristen's note here. So.
Oh, okay.
So so it seems like, in terms of pushing those boundaries, you have to think about individual development.
Well, I think you're still running into some problems here of conflating the participation as a sport, like, am I going to race? Am I not going to race? With when we're talking ADM, so if we are really talking about ADM, we're talking about what are the things at this age that a child can learn through cycling and that they need to learn about cycling. And competition and participation and all those things, those are the places in which they do it. And those are other ways in which we can make sure that they learn and gain the lessons. We often talk about at this age, competition is the servant, not the master. But you could say the same thing for going on the adventure camping trip with your bike and your stuff. But if we're backing up and we're saying, how much should a child at this age speed training? How much time are they spending on the bike? How much of that
That's
time?
the next, I think that's the next question.
Okay.
So
is
what
that
types of activities, and then after that is how much.
right? And
So-
that needs to be driven by what we know about pediatric exercise physiology, which is relatively low. So we're going on best practices. We need to be very careful about which sports we look at, because some of them are doing the work behind this and some are not. So the whole idea that, kids practice 3 to 5 times a week at high school, that's just because that's the model that's been perpetuated. That's not necessarily what best practice. We've got models right now that are putting kids at 2nd grade in travel soccer year round.
Well, that's exactly my point, is that, and I use the, PHS guidelines as, as the gold standard. And then it's like, okay, let's, how do we interface with that, and because I know that that's not quite right, because those are minimum standards. They're not like, really developing somebody for the future. I mean, they're minimums. So in this case, when we go back to where the activities are run, it's primarily local, and maybe there's some room for pushing boundaries, to ensure that they get some other piece of their development. But for the most part, you're doing everything at the local level. And that was basically what I wanted to understand, was within this realm of what we're doing with the kids, how much travel should there be? Because right now we live in a travel sports world, and my gut instinct has always been that's probably not a correct model, even though that's what the market has been pushing. Is that fair assessment? Okay.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's based on an adult model of education and youth sport.
Okay.
Not education, entertainment. Sorry.
Yeah. So the next part of this is, what types of activities do they do? And it seems like, primarily it's local training and racing, with strong mentorship and coaching. That's what kind of came out of the conversation. And then having a few key goal-oriented events during the year, that may be regionally based, but, it seems like some of that has room to be kind of more local, also. So, like Durango Devo does like shuttle trips. They do shred rides and things like that are, kind of special events, or camping trips. And then, it seems like you can do a real competitive race, or something that's non-competitive. And I throw in the Fondos gravel grinders. And, in our sport's so unique, these things can become really family oriented, depending on the activities you do. And I don't know where that piece of the puzzle comes in, especially if these kids are starting to explore their boundaries and they want to get away from their parents, but at some age groups, it may be more family appropriate, or maybe they're just on course at the same time. And I've certainly done that with my kids. They just, they ride away, and, and I ride at a slower pace. So how does that fit into the scheme? Anything to add? I mean, there were some other things, regarding, that, a lot of times the youth events in the cycling market are an afterthought. And it seemed like having them specific, I mean, NICA makes youth specific events, and so they do really well, but associated with that, you have really high production value. And when you think about your traditional kind of bike race type atmosphere, they're not high production value. They're very low production value.
Well, if we're getting back to the fact that this is about kids' development, what's appropriate, there's a lot of, track and field's done a good bit of work in this area, as has triathlon, and taking a look at, should kids do long epic distances? And the general consensus is no. From a psychological perspective or physical. Now, we can push the boundaries a little bit on the bike, different than a running situation, but still, from a developmental perspective, for the average kid, for most kids, it's not going to be, unless they've, really been engaged for a very, very, very long time, or they are one of those anomaly kids. But we're still coming back to that idea of, is this really about, why do kids' races need to be high production value? That's feeding right into the travel sport culture and all this. there's something to be said for the concept around deliberate play and deliberate practice. If you look at, again, the research of talent development, Erickson's work and some of the others, we're really looking at this idea that creating environments for kids to deliberately play with little bits of skill development, little bits of opportunities, sort of like the programs that Hannah's talking about. We're giving them a little advice and then we're pulling back because it's about their growth and development. Those things don't need to be high production. Little League, it does not need to have the World Series event, a couple t-shirts and a sandlot. There's something to be said for that organic environment, and then slowly introducing deliberate practice that, to David's earlier point, that kids don't process work the same way. That going from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation is a process over time. And so how do we help families recognize that? How do we help coaches recognize that moving kids towards competition, moving them towards life engagement is going to be more along the lines of those conversations, not about are they putting on events and races for kids? Because that's, again, going back into a systems piece, not focusing on what the kids need. I would put more forth that how do we help events, if we're going to talk that way, put together programs that create engagement spaces, that create playgrounds, that metaphorical playgrounds, places for kids to play at sport, rather than forcing them right into the adult-driven model of competition as we.
Right. And so, that's again why we bring it up. And, and it was interesting, when we had the discussion, there was very little discussion of these high production value events. And I just put it in there because that's the model NICA is using, right? When BJC, you can see it down here at the end, is that they develop a benefit ride in the fall. And I don't know, the production value may be a little bit high on that. It sounds like it's a bit of work for them, but it's all done locally for their organization, and they're doing it for a benefit for themselves, but it's high fun factor and fundraising, right? And Durango Devo does things in that same kind of space, right? But it's all coach driven. The coaches put it together, right? It's not like you're bringing in big event companies and that kind of jazz, right? Which is much more what NICA is doing, is they're going off on that professional production type of experience, which goes into the entertainment type stuff. And so, then it becomes like, if you're going to do things like that, how often would you do them at all? Right. And it sounds like that would be pretty darn rare. And it sounds like they're not really necessary. And we can be relying more on these directed activities that are fun for the kids. Is that what we're really looking at? Part of the question would be like, at what point do I take Johnny to go to the Fondo, right? To the Palm Springs Century or something like that, right? And there's different options. You don't have to do 100 miles. You can do 25 or 50 or whatever. At what point does that become an important part of this? And, as a coach, you can start using things like that as hey, we're going to go get ready to do this thing. And that can become a nice goal for you to do the 50 miler.
Well, I think you kind of answered your own question, Sean. That directive usually comes from the coach standpoint. And so that should be something that's directed into the coaches, whether it's a cycling coach or a PE coach, as to when that is appropriate.
And that's the basic question, is when is that appropriate? Is that appropriate at this level, or are we really talking about somebody that's now in a performance track of some sort?
I think when you get into a high school level, it's definitely at a more performance level. Middle school and elementary school, it's still developmental. And, needs to be kept in the community. That's my opinion and my feelings towards it. And because of cycling being such a multi-level activity, that it's not like most kids will focus on, let's say, velodrome, track riding, Okay, that's when they focus down. That's going to be in the high school level, more likely, and then the travel will be in the high school level, such as age 15 and up.
Well, and if we look at sport participation in general, you ever coach at the high school level, the vast majority of kids who participate in the sport are doing it because they like to be around their friends. They like to be physically active. When we look at kids and we ask them why they participate, it's fun. They like being around their friends. They like feeling competent about something. It is their parents, it is culture, it is everything else that is saying they need to compete and they need to be against each other, and they need to get scholarships, they need to do all of those. Kids participate the same reason that they do almost everything else they choose to do, whether it's Pokemon or Legos or anything else. It's because it's enjoyable, it fits their interests, fits their needs. And so I do think, again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves when we start talking about all those places in which they can race, how they can race, things like that. That creating the opportunities and the outlets for the different types of kids who are going to be in different spaces becomes about the same as deciding if you're going to have an AP science class and a regular science class and maybe something over in the shop, applied science without theory kind of approaches, depending on where kids are in their spaces. That comes after you first figure out what kids at this level need. What are the outcomes we're trying to build towards, which was what you did at the beginning. And so I think a lot of this will change and evolve as you flesh that out and you really place on this continuum, knowing that ADM models, while they have an age piece to it, are also applicable to the kid. It'll be a different timeline with the kids older, but still following the same pathway. Somebody doesn't pick it up until they're 12 or 14 or 16. So that, again, there's so many factors that influence some of these different pieces, but at the end of the day, what would we like in an ideal world for a high school kid who is riding their bike to learn and develop? What should they be able to do? Where are the places where we can help them build, overcoming the frustration, basic mechanics, some of those, what are the things that we need them, that we know they can get out of cycling from a well-developed program at that age? And then
it's all local.
Well, here's the thing. Going back to what Chris is talking about, basically what you want is you want a kid who's willing to ride their bike to school versus saving all their money so they can drive a car to school. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Because, like, I live in the burbs. Everything's pretty far away, spread out. And a lot of kids don't ride their bikes long ways to school. You see a lot of kids ride to the middle school because it's close. There's a lot of middle schools, so the closer kids will ride there. But like for my kids, it's 5 miles away, slightly downhill, and it was like pulling teeth to get them to ride to school, and I had to ride with them and all these things, and so I think the whole racing component actually really isn't something we should be thinking about in terms of building. I'm trying to think of the word, but sort of again, it goes back to getting the DNA, getting the cycling DNA into a kid. Racing really isn't the focus, because that basically creates its own, it becomes obvious to the kid, and all that stuff is already there, because like Chris is saying, the adult model is there already, so we don't even need to play in that space. Our goal is to bring as many kids into the sport, and at some point they will find their way, whether it's at 15 they want to do a 100-mile fondo, or they want to just ride 20 miles, or they want to ride to the store and back down the street. That's what's important. And I think at the point, again, that's what Freddie always says, the cream will rise to the top. We don't have to do that. We don't have to focus on that. That'll happen organically. It does in every sport,
So I have it down here based on this conversation that, focusing on the developmental stage of the child first, which is kind of what Kristen was getting at. And then everything else will flow from that space. And then it goes into what the conversation was we had earlier today, which is everything's predominantly local training and, whatever the racing platform looks like, or, competition between friends with strong mentorship components and coaching. And then, all the other stuff I was talking about isn't important, basically.
Yeah. Well, here's what's different now. When we were growing up racing bikes, there was no internet. There was no YouTube. We couldn't watch 10 years of Tour de France stages. If a kid loves cycling, there's all these online magazines, there's print magazines, there's the YouTube stuff. There's a lot more resources for kids now at that level, right? If they want to go race in the Tour de France, they can study the Tour de France from, the beginning to end. I mean, from the very first race in the 1900s to now on YouTube. We couldn't do that stuff. So it's easier for kids at the higher level to actually sort of move through that pathway, right? For us, but nothing's changed at the developmental level of just increasing the pool, the size of the talent pool. Nothing's changed there. Technology hasn't helped, or it hasn't been taken advantage of. It's there, but people haven't been utilizing it. The resources aren't there. They've never been there. So that's, I think, where you were talking about, Sean, where we really need to focus our efforts, because everything else after that basically takes care of itself. I mean, that's the easier part for us as a group to deal with. Once a kid gets to that point, there's tons of pathways. There's plenty of people who will sponsor that kid. There's companies that will sponsor that kid and give him all the speed suits and the time trial bikes and all that stuff. Once that kid gets to that level, there's a lot of ways for them to be even more successful. But that really shouldn't be our focus.
Kristen basically typed it in here that can we improve the pathways? Yes, but the base of the pathways is not there. It's never been developed, and that's why we're having this conversation. And nobody's ever taken the time to develop it, right? And USA Cycling has been putting out fires basically year over year. And now we're at this point where it's like, okay, somebody has to do something. And so we're taking that on. So I'm going to skip ahead. I mean, I think we've kind of nailed down that most everything can be local, and we really got to consider the development of the kid, and all that other stuff is fluff, and we don't really need it.
No, because it'll take care. Honestly, it'll come, but it'll be so much easier to deal with. Really, that's the easy part. That's the gravy, right?
Yeah.
That's finding that one kid that you've been coaching in AU basketball that's going to the NBA. That's what I mean.
So Kristen was kind of hitting on this next part, which is, what does training look like for these kids, right? And and there's a couple different, people threw out some of their things that they're doing, and I was basically going back to the health services guidelines, which are it's basically an hour every day kind of thing, which is minimal, and associated with that, I mean, we don't have to come up with training zones or any of that crap, but a critical question that I have, from a physiology standpoint, at what point are you actually trying to introduce training periodization techniques and things of that nature? Because I haven't seen anything that really provides good guidance for that. Kristen, have you run across anything that really provides guidance?
This is where we may need to bring in somebody like Joe Eisenman or some of the guys who do a lot with some of the LTD and physiology stuff. But again, we are so lacking in good pediatric exercise physiology information. It doesn't exist. We have a couple of textbooks with very little information. But nothing says that you can't introduce some sort of, as soon as we start bringing kids into sports teams, we've started to provide a bit of a structure. It's just not adult periodization. And that adult periodization of planning and training is going to have to do with the training history of the kid, the interest in the goals. So it's not so much that there's a certain age you start to do it. It's because you're going to be doing it. As soon as you have them on a team, I hope you have a curriculum. I hope you're periodizing. I hope there's a plan. Even your high school baseball coach is doing it. It's just how well it's being done. And it depends on how individualized it is, how specialized it is, just that kid, and how much to the group, because they don't need that yet. It's how intense is it, and how much are you trying to model it after the way an adult athlete trains versus, because we do this in all of our high school sports. They are periodized. You've got your preseason, you got your midseason, you got your postseason, you got your hard days, your easy days. That's already there, and you can do that. It's appropriate at the high school level. It's just how rigid is it? How specialized is it? How intense is it? How much is it supposed to be about? the broader base of development versus that one kid just nailing it like they're somehow a semi-pro at the age of 15. So it's not that the science says that you should or shouldn't do it. It's how are you applying it is probably the bigger question.
Right. Yeah, but I was
I
thinking of
think
the
that
formalized number of hours that you're throwing at a kid, right? That in terms of periodization. But yes, certainly, even at the youngest age groups, you have a
Yep.
plan, right? If you don't have a plan, you're going to fail.
And there is some limited information, but again, there's some limited information about how many hours of training should a kid do. And I can dig into that and pull it up, but it really is again going to come down to, we've got, bigger safety travel issues. How far are we putting the kids out on the bike and where they're going? But it's also going to be dependent on their training history. If I'm training a cross country running kid and they're coming into my program as a 14-year-old and they're doing a lot of sport, they're only going to run low volume. If I've got a 14-year-old who's been running for a couple of years and has tons of time in soccer, I might give them more volume because they've been an athlete for longer. The same is going to go for my cycle. I've got a kid who's brand new to it. I may only have him riding 2 days a week, but that's a little bit anecdotal. We have to back up, and there is some science to suggest what's a kid physiologically ready, and what can their bodies handle based on what they've done before. But it's limited. It's very limited.
Yeah. Well, that's Freddie and I talk about this because both our kids are high-level soccer players.
Mhm.
So when we have them on the bike, we have them just doing total zone 2 stuff because they get so much intensity at their practices.
Mhm.
So we keep them, anything that's not a practice is basically essentially recovery and just endurance training. So there's that. But also the difference thing about a bike too is you can go out for a 3-hour bike ride and only be pedaling for an hour,
Mhm.
right? So that's why it's hard with kids, because you're just saying, okay, go ride your bike.
Yep.
Well, they might be gone for 2 or 3 hours, but they might have stopped at the store for an hour, or they might have just been coasting around. So, right?
Well, and on the flip side of that too, you've got to think about, from a mental perspective, is it appropriate that kids have that sort of, and some do and some don't. And so again, if we're looking at the average kid, the average place, Sean, to your question, I think we would need to bring in somebody like a Joe Eisenman or Tony Moreno might be helpful. He's up there with McGregor at Eastern. There's a couple guys we might be able to bring in and have some of those conversations, but I don't think we're going to get hard and fast science. We're going to get some recommendations. Bollier might be able to help with that. Way or Higgs up from Canada, that were some of the foundational LTAD model guys, might be able to help as well.
Okay.
Sean, I think the other day, I guess this was on Sunday, it was mentioned that it would be a good thing for USAC to designate coaches differently based on who they're trained to coach or what they're trained to coach. Because truly, my experience, and you guys who know me know, I'm just a parent. I'm not a coach, but I see so many kids who are at the competition level that CJ's at, so high competition level for a 15-year-old, who are overtraining big time. And even CJ will come in and he's like looked at their Strava and he's like, "Mom, they're overtraining. Who's coaching them?" And a lot of the problem is they're being coached by someone who has only coached adults. They've never coached juniors before. They don't have a clue what that junior should be doing. And like Kristen said before, they're pushing them right into that adult model.
Right. And I've seen that, time and time again. We have kids that are being taken out of basically school at fairly early ages to go into basically an adult model, an adult tracking. And to me, it's very worrisome, especially as an academic, trying to move those things forward for the, looking with the kid in mind. Kristen's left the conversation. She had to go deal with her young one. It's 10:30 there now. It's 10:30 there, Katie.
It's 10:30. Yeah.
Yeah. So late there.
What you were saying though about seeing kids who leave school, for example, it is really, from a parent perspective, it's very, very difficult, because when you have a kid like CJ, for example, he wants to be a pro cyclist. Like, that's his whole dream. That's not something that I've pushed on him in any way. it is his thing. And so, of course, I, as a parent, want him to continue his education, want him to go to college, want him to do what he needs to do. But the cycling world, quote unquote, is not giving him that message currently.
Right. And that's, I mean, that's what we're trying to overcome. I mean, that's part of the goal, right? Is to overcome those types of issues. So let's jump ahead. I mean, basically what we've come up with, in terms of training plan design, which is really what we're talking about, we need a deeper examination. We need to look at the evidence a bit more before we can put anything really concrete down about that. But we know that there has to be, a curriculum type of program in there that's going to drive things. So the next thing, that we really discussed was delineating the athletes based on physical or developmental age, because we know that you can have huge differences, especially in the middle school and in high school age groups. They can be all over the map. And based on, best practices coming out of, our larger institutions, which is Boulder Junior and Durango Devo, they kind of approach it a little bit differently, but both of them say that it's not mutually exclusive, and you have to really look at that. You have to look at the matrix and what is, again, going back to that, athlete-centric universe, is you have to figure out what's best for that athlete, and being flexible and coming up with creative solutions are a critical part of that. And it seems like they move kids, and generally what they talked about was moving kids up. It can be viewed as a positive, but taking a kid and moving them down with younger age groups can be a negative. And I don't know how we're going to have a discussion about that at some point, what that might look like, and come up with recommendations. But certainly I don't think we have to do that at this stage. That's much more down in the weeds. And the only other things to think about is, and some of these things go along with, getting your own coach versus having a club coach and everybody tracking together, is that a lot of times, and really what we're seeing in our sport, is athletes getting individual coaches at very early ages. And basically they're getting singled out and entering performance tracks at a very early age. And so they're getting treated special relative to everybody else. And what does that look like? I mean, we don't have those, and we don't have the people running those large teams on the call tonight. They were on earlier. But, I think one of the things that we're going to have to talk about moving forward is what that might look like. I mean, I don't know if anybody has any comments about that, because I really don't. My son is, even though he's been working within our group, he's been coached by Barney for many years, and it's always been a really good working relationship where, that Barney understands what we're doing within our group, and he makes sure that Hunter's program fit within the scope of the group for the most part, and so there was good opportunities for him to be socially engaged. But a lot of coaches don't do things like that. They just look purely at the performance aspect and not at that social component. Any comments? I mean, David, you're running sports programs, so I mean, I don't know if you're running across these things in your things.
Where'd everybody go, Sean?
Yeah, they're here. They're just everybody's got their mics off. I think we lost.
I had to run out of the office, so I turned my mic off on my.
Oh, okay. So
Honestly, I just think it's a lot to process, Sean. I think I'm thinking about what you're saying.
Well, I mean, we can leave it open-ended. I mean, we don't have to come to any kind of agreement on these things. We talked a lot about bicycles, and that that the goals are really try to get the cost as low as possible and keep the bikes affordable. And that's going to be something that will probably take a long time to work with manufacturers to overcome a lot of those barriers. And it's something that, I think we're going to have subgroups working on. The next part is, the cost of the activities. The Boulder Junior has, a solid pricing structure, and it's not cheap, right? They're looking at $18 to $25 per session for longer sessions, which is really what's happening with these kids as they move forward. And then NICA events can be anywhere from $40 to $80 per event. So, things get very expensive, very quickly, for the families, and that becomes a real issue, to make sure that we're providing accessibility for the club structures.
NICA is definitely out of my price range. Just saying.
Yeah, I mean, right now, even during COVID, it's $280 for the kids that are from our program that are going into it. It's ridiculous, right? And a lot of parents are angry. I'm actually a NICA coach, so I'm on their Discord channel, so I see the comments. There are a lot of people that are very unhappy. But if we're talking about getting rid of a lot of that event-driven programming, that's really a major driver in our marketplace now. Then it falls more into the community-based models, and the dollars are going to drop by a lot if we push that.
I guess the question,
or into an educational boundary. Yeah.
Or into an educational environment, and at which point
Right.
we can get 100% funding possibly to run those things, right?
Right. Yes.
And then
Go ahead.
the last part of this, unless anybody has any other discussions about, what the costs are to run activities, is really, where does the funding come from and funding sources? I mean, so, right now, when you think about the general club model, is that a lot of the funding is, coming from parents, right? In a pay for play kind of model. The teams are trying to get money from regional and national sponsors, and that money is going through the floor. Most of it's gone now. And there are other fundraising opportunities that people are using, a lot of it local. And then there's also grant mechanisms like the grant that I got from Outride to drive, our, really our educational pieces within our club. But there can also be, Alan Lim, when I talked with him, is to have like a tax-based program analogous to what People for Bikes uses, which is really a tiding type program based on, how much people make, how much the businesses make. I mean, you could do something similar to that. We are going to have a specific discussion with Durango Devo and Star Trek to talk about pay for play versus free programming, and looking at those models. But are there any other real funding solutions?
Oh, when it comes to education, they all now school district can apply directly to a federal funding to get money for the bicycle program. That's what LAUSD did for this one that we started, then COVID came in, and it's the biggest grant we've ever had, $1.38 million. That includes bicycles for the different middle schools and equipment, and it's all out of transportation federal funding.
So it's DOT, not DOE.
Yeah, DOT.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Department of Transportation. But the most amazing thing is that now recently the government has allocated that the schools can apply for the grant funding directly. Before the city had to apply, then the money would go through the city down to the school district. Now the school districts can apply directly.
Okay. So
because
so we're relying
they're
on,
looking at the. Yeah, go ahead.
so we're at that point we're reliant on the grant writers within the school district, and they're gonna, at the school district level, they're gonna have to want the program, right?
Right, and see, this is what I did for 25 years in LA Unified. I wrote the proposals for the grants. And any school district or organization that wants to apply, like the LAUSD grant, I helped write that proposal. And sorry for the airplane going overhead. And it's a helicopter, military helicopter. Where you going, dude? Anyway, when I applied, I also make the application and the proposal available to any other school district who wants to do it and do the same thing.
And so would that be a resource that you would potentially allow us
Sure.
to have within?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that's been my standard of operation for, because it's a new animal, as you know, in writing grants and proposals. When you deal with a different agency, you have to learn their language.
Yep. Yeah. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So related to that, thinking about different school districts and things like that, like, and we just had a discussion with San Bernardino, because like I said, I'm working with Outride, and we want to run a research program to look at the efficacy of their programs in it's a real research program in socioeconomically stressed environments. And
right.
when we talked to San Bernardino, they were like, "Oh my God, this is great. We love you." I cannot even get anybody to respond in Redlands. It's basically they don't care.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And so that's where, based on your experiences now, if we had USA Cycling come in and basically say, we need this here, right? We need Redlands to have this type of environment, and, they make the push as opposed to me making the push. Is something like that going to help?
Well, anytime you can say, here's an example of how you could go get some funding. And see, the check with the Department of Transportation for that city as to whether or not they're pushing to have bicycling as an alternative form of transportation for their city. That's pretty much across the board. Well, you put that together with a program in the schools, you're done.
And then what about the Safe Routes for Schools component? How does that fit into this scope?
In what way?
Well, just, I have interfaced in the past, and I'm interfacing with him now. The person that does Safe Routes for School out here, right? And he works for the county, and they get funding at the state level, I think, or is it federal money? I can't remember which. But
it's probably Office of Traffic Safety, because I get state funding as well. That is basically federal money based, but it just goes down to the state and then down to the city. So yes, Safe Routes to School, definitely.
And so then, I'm just looking at the synergy component between, a scholastic component, and you have this other component, which is now bridging the kids so they can get to school safely. And I know he's had a lot of difficulties, interfacing with schools and things like that too, to get his program even off and running.
That's happened because schools right now, well, of course, during the COVID with everybody shut down and having trouble, but that's always the case dealing with educators. There's only so much money there. But if you are bringing in a program that's going to bring in its own funding, they're much more open to it. Yeah, especially when you're dealing with the safety of the kids getting to school.
Yeah, he's bringing his own money, and and he's having difficulty with the schools. With
the
schools, yeah. But
I'm
when
surprised.
He also has the ability to use what is it called? Move Your Way. So what it's called? It's another federal program that interface. It's part of that same kind of health and wellness piece within. And so it's related, but it's on foot, right? And so he's having he can get a lot of buy-in for doing, pedestrian type stuff, but not so much for the bike piece. And so he's doing what he can, but it seems like if we can get both pieces in place at once, we might be able to use levers to make that happen.
True. Oh, hey, anything that you can to get it to work.
Yeah.
And it's for the safety of the kids. If they're going to be out on a bike, and they're riding to school, trust me, at any school with any conscious who want some type of program where they learn how to be traffic, cognizant.
David, do you have any other, or Freddie, do you guys have any other comments about kind of working in this space of funding?
No, not at all. I mean, the only thing we had out here was when we would talk to some schools is they didn't want the liability. That was the biggest thing for them. But that's about it. I mean, in terms of the funding, it's nobody out here was willing, or up here was willing to write those grants and things like that. But now that they're there, and Tana's been working in that space already, it might be something to revisit.
And something with the school district that is very leery of that type of education, you can explain to them that you're giving the child the knowledge. It's up to them to implement them. You're not going to take the kids out, riding in the streets. You're teaching them traffic safety, on campus.
Right.
And that's my programs are such that all the educational components take place on campus. And I have one section in one of the lesson plans where the kids design their own streets, so what streets they think are safe, and they invite in the local engineer to come work with them. Then they go out on their asphalt area of their playground, and they actually draw out the streets, and then the police can come and pretend like, oh, this is a good, this is good, blah, blah, blah. And then the kids ride their bicycles on the streets that they design. It's education, it's knowledge, but at the same time, it teaches them a different way of looking at traffic and safety.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last piece that I'd like to talk about before we break for the evening is the DEI considerations. And I know David and Freddie, you work a lot in this space, and Tana, a lot of your things bridge in here too. And so what, I mean, the most critical thing is these are significant issues and there's no real easy solution to this. And, in a lot of locations, there can be no local access to cycling opportunities. And Happy Freeman talked about that, in New York City, a lot of the schools don't even have playgrounds. So it makes it extremely difficult. And from my own experience and others, that there can be difficulty actually getting into schools to build the programs out. And then when you think about it from a fundamental level, you have programs like yours or Outride, where you're bringing the bikes to the kids. And then the other option is things like Velo Youth in San Diego, which you take the kids to the bikes. And so those are your two basic options. And it seems like, there's certainly strengths and weaknesses associated with both. And I've talked a lot with David about this in the past. I don't know if we need to go beyond that level of just saying that these are your options. And they should both be considered when building out a program. But it seemed like having, and this kind of came out of some of the conversations, having USAC have a blanket curriculum, or, we have the blanket curriculum, would lend legitimacy to starting any program and gaining sponsors for any kind of DEI considered program, right? We can walk in the door and say, this is what needs to happen. This is what you need to do. Like, walk in the door with the YES program and say, this is what you need to do in order to make this happen. Is there any other conversation about that?
No, it's the fun part with dealing with LA Unified School District is, and I've dealt with other school districts, as Sean knows, it's so huge. I deal in all different types of areas, infrastructures, and what have you. So it gave me a chance to find solutions for different schools in different areas. And whatever program is introduced, it's got to be understood that there is flexibility to help bring bicycling to whatever type of environment that community has, whether it's a velodrome because there's no mountains, too much on the road, or just whatever.
Yeah, I think that's that next level that we need to have a discussion about, right? Is, which silo do you go down, and then having curricular pieces that are appropriate for each of those silos, and that'll come later, right? Is there any last minute thoughts? I mean, otherwise we'll kind of end here for tonight. I mean, we've been almost 2 hours again, for a total 4 hours today on this stuff.
Sean, I personally want to say thank you for all the work and time, all these years and commitment that you have given. It's awesome.
Yeah, thanks for all the work today,
Yeah, thanks.
amongst other things.
It's a passion, and it falls in my wheelhouse to, I saw the opportunity at this stage that's open because people were starting to have real conversations, and it provides us a lever point to be able to actually design something from an overview standpoint, and then be able to forward it. So, I talked to Rob tomorrow morning, and kind of I'm going to give him a 30-minute update on where we're at. And some of the conversation is going to be pretty harsh towards them, right? Is that they don't have the time or the resources to do the job that needs to be done, because this is basically a 10-year project starting now, right? I mean, this isn't, nothing gets solved overnight, and that's what USA Cycling has always tried to do, is solve things overnight.
Yes, so true.
That's what happens when you care about revenue.
It's a necessary evil for them, right? I mean,
Yep.
so that's part of the next stage of our conversation is we're going to develop this. And when you look at it from a holistic perspective, is we cannot hand it over to USA Cycling because they won't be able to do anything with it. And that's from just a practical standpoint, not even theoretical. And so it's like, okay, now we've got to do the build out, which is going to take time and money. And
Yep.
so, and that's where, we need to start thinking about, funding streams and things of that nature. That comes next, right?
Yep.
Any other last minute thoughts before we close out?
Excuse me, Sean, I need to go take care of an emergency. Thank you, and we'll talk soon. Bye.
Thank you for coming on.
Yes.
David, Freddie, any last minute things?
Nothing for me.
Nothing for me, Sean. I was just a listener today, just kind of, making sure that I'm part of the process here, and I'll definitely jump in when appropriate. And we have David here from Fast Ready Foundation, that's very passionate about everything we're doing. So thank you again for putting all this together for us and getting the right people, Kristen, involved to spearhead this in the right direction. I know USA Cycling is a little bit off the back, but hopefully we can nicely bring them into the pack and help them move up to the front of the field and help us be part of the team.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see about that, right? It's, the other parts of the equation are, if we develop something, will they actually accept it?
Yeah. So, I mean, baby steps, I guess, as anything else, it's like, if you look at athlete development, we take steps, we don't try to leap forward. And so I know with David and I involved, we're going to be very passionate on the community and making sure this is fun, this is playful. I posted a little thing about a soccer program called Joy for the People, which is kind of a good model that I kind of like inspired that we look for a little bit, just about play. We want these kids to be having fun. So I know that we're looking at this as a development model and a curriculum, but again, we always have to stay focused to the fact that, the curriculum should be about kids having fun, kids enjoying the process, and everything else will follow, as David said. So thank you.
So I've had a number of conversations with Ben, who you connected me with at iRide, and they use a play-based model for their stuff. And I've actually asked them the simple business question: how much is it going to cost to license your guys' program? It's a simple question. I'm waiting for them to give me the number, right? and I told him I'd beta test it, you know, to see what that looks like, how that interface looks like.
When you look at USA Soccer, US Soccer, and what they've been trying to do with their whole academy programs and everything, part of the reason they created such a robust system, which is not working, was because they kind of realized in the U.S. we're kind of losing play, and they're like, and kids need more play. How do we fake that? And so they created these 4-day-a-week, you know, practices and stuff like that, and trying to make it more playful. But at the end of the day, it's not real, you know. So I feel that, you know, their failure is kind of a little bit of like, they were on the right track, like realizing that play was a big part of it, more play. And so it's how do we, as cycling, figure out that part of it, but make it more organic, more holistic, more about the play, and not make it so curriculum based. It's like about, you know, development, you know, even though that we as the coaches and the parents want that, you know, for the kids, it's just play.
Well, I mean, so that's what, you know, in Durango Devo, you know, Chad really went into it, is that they, you know, they have one primary thing that they want to impart for the day, right? So that's the curriculum piece, but then the rest of it is kind of basically free play. They're out there riding and having fun, but then they just bring them back and reinforce that one critical piece. And so it's, you know, so it becomes kind of that free play atmosphere. And I think, you know, and I haven't seen under the hood of the iRide program, but I think it has a lot of those same kind of elements built in, right? He was talking about, you know, that within this level, say a green level, is that you have all these different games you can play, right? And, you know, if you look at it from the standpoint of what is your environment, if you're working like in Durango Devo, they have a lot of trail systems, so that makes it real easy for them to go out and ride and stuff. But if you're working on at a parking lot or a playground or something like that, it's kind of fixed. And so, you know, you every 5 minutes you can be just changing it up. As soon as the kids get bored, you just do something else, right? But it's all game oriented. And so it becomes, to the kid, it looks like it's just a bunch of fun games that they're doing, but really you're just building out their skill base. And we do a lot of that kind of stuff, but, you know, ours is probably a little overly focused, you know, on the actual curriculum itself. And so, you know, moving to more of a game style makes it more fun for the kids. Well, great. If there's nothing else, I mean, we'll call it a night, and we'll have transcripts of this stuff. And then on Thursday night, I'll build out the slide deck, and then we just kind of go through the slide deck and make it, you know, kind of perfect it. In this case, we're going to have a lot of holes. I can already see it, you know, and that's, I think that's fine, right? Is that we don't want to get too specific, and kind of, you know, Kristen was kind of drilling on that, and we'll just leave those holes open and we can deal with them later on. All right. Have a good night, and thanks for coming on.
Okay. Thanks, John.
All right.